My name is Lauren Redmore, and I am a research social scientist at the Aldo Leopold Wilderness Research Institute, based out of Missoula, Montana. And today I'll be presenting on some work that myself and my colleagues recently finished. My colleagues Jacqueline Rushing and Kelly Kareem, who were not able to join me today. And so today I'll be sharing some lessons learned from social science research on advancing federal tribal shared stewardship of wild and scenic rivers. For those of you who are not familiar, the Aldo Leopold Wilderness Research Institute is the sole federal research facility focused on advancing wilderness stewardship through transformational science. We're based in Missoula, Montana, on the campus of University of Montana, and we currently have a staff of 3 social scientists, an aquatic ecologist, and a science communication specialist, in addition to our director. And we develop our world-class wilderness research around 5 key research priority areas, including climate and disturbance, biodiversity conservation, shared stewardship, wilderness access, and stewardship effectiveness. As you can imagine, this project really speaks to that 3rd research priority area on shared stewardship. This work was really shaped by my background as an environmental anthropologist. So it is really an anthropological study using qualitative methods. For those of you who are not familiar with the field of environmental anthropology, we study the relationships between culture and the environment. Something you might have heard from other anthropologists, if you've ever met one, is we like to make the familiar strange. That means we really like to uncover things that might seem very obvious to the rest of us in order to really tease it apart to understand what's going on with something that is maybe somebody who's in it might not see as very special. And we do this work with an interdisciplinary approach, often bridging disciplines. And I always like to say that the research approach influences what questions you ask and what you find. So many folks who have a science background might be coming from a more quantitative background that's really numerically driven. And when you're doing statistical analyses, what you do is you look at the averages, you discard the outliers as noise. If anything that's kind of too far on the edge is an exception and not really what you want to look at. But if you're doing qualitative research, which is using words, we understand that those outliers are really special. They can help us to understand how and why something is happening, and they can also help us to move the needle in terms of best practices and the kinds of efforts that happen on the ground. As I mentioned, I'll be sharing some work based on the International Journal of Wilderness article, which you'll be able to access in the link. And I'm really proud of this work because it did take several years from start to finish, as research often does. For those of you who might not be super familiar with the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, it was signed in 1968, designating wild, scenic, and recreational rivers. I know that the NWSI had some earlier sessions on this, so definitely look back at those if you have some time later. And it has designated over 13,000 miles of river. It's actually not that much in comparison to how many rivers we have across the country. And we'll be digging into just a very small portion of that in this work. Starting in 2022, the Interagency Wild and Scenic River Coordinating Committee decided to put forth a tribal subcommittee, recognizing that tribes have a really strong vested interest in river management and in waters more generally. And the focus of this subcommittee was to understand existing tribal engagement efforts, treaty rights and policies, to promote a greater understanding of effective tribal engagement, and to engage tribal relations specialists across agencies. And it's really the subcommittee that put forth this challenge to myself and my colleagues of what's going on with shared stewardship in the wild and scenic river space, and how can we move the needle for the agencies so that we're doing it in a better way, in a good way. Now, for those of you who are asking yourselves, what is shared stewardship? There's a lot of definitions out there. We took sort of a broad definition that is voluntary partnerships to align goals, share data, and coordinate action around management decisions. And that can be with or without the transfer of legal decision-making authority. We were sort of interested, not necessarily just in what's been signed into policy, but what's kind of happening even when there's not that formal decision-making authority granted. And there's many benefits as well as challenges to shared stewardship with tribes. It's not just a win-win. There's a lot of complexity there. And so we didn't want to be Pollyannish about it. So some of those benefits are that it can strengthen tribal treaty rights, it can restore tribal dignity in land relations, and it can incorporate indigenous knowledge. There's also a lot of challenges. Again, if you're kind of working without that formal authority, you're not necessarily going to have that enforcement power. Sometimes, it doesn't come with funding or capacity in the way that you might expect it to. And they're also subject to changing administrative priorities, as we all are. And so recognizing that, we were really curious, what does this look like on the ground? And again, I know that there was another session at NWSI on the outstandingly remarkable values of wild and scenic rivers. We're not so much focusing on that, but we do want to highlight that there are a number of these ORVs, including fish, wildlife, history, culture, recreation, and they're supposed to benefit all of Americans. But there's a lot of questions about if and how these benefits are reaching our tribal partners and tribal nations. So we know that they're reaching society again, but we want to make sure that those ORVs are in fact aligning with tribes and tribal values. I'm going to pick on a state that I've worked in quite a bit recently, South Dakota. In the state of South Dakota, there's 9,500 miles of river, and 93 of those are designated as recreational river, the Missouri Recreational River. So that's 1%, which is actually better than the national average. And it was designated in 1978. And there was an additional segment added in 1991 that you see here on this map. And when we look at the 1998 management plan, some of these comprehensive river management plans are really where you outline the vision for how you want to manage these rivers. And what we see across within this plan, as well as across many other plans, is that history really begins with Western settlement, and recreational users are the key audience. And so we're highlighting here that there's a mention of prehistoric villages that really signifies, history beginning with the root of Lewis and Clark. There is a mention of the territorial capital of the Yankton tribe and ethnic settlements. But again, they're focusing on enriching the visitor's understanding of past and present cultures. So there's a lot of dated language in some of these older plans. But we also want to highlight that old plans provide an opportunity to update them. So there's a lot of dated plans out there, and it allows us the opportunity to imagine something new as we move forward with this work. And so without a lot of guidance on how to successfully implement shared stewardship, it provides a great opportunity to dig into some of these questions. So this research really sought to answer, what does wild and scenic river federal tribal shared stewardship look like? What are the successes and challenges of federal tribal wild and scenic river shared stewardship? And what are some key lessons learned that can inform other shared stewardship opportunities? Now, again, I mentioned that this is a qualitative study. We took a comparative case study approach. For those of you who might be a little bit familiar, a case study relies on those unique examples, something that's happening on the margins, the outliers. And often you're examining one particular moment and space and time. You're kind of seeking to understand more about how the actors and systems influence an outcome. But we wanted to take a comparative case study approach, recognizing that looking at more than one case in together can help us to understand how different dynamics lead to divergent or similar outcomes. It offers more of an explanatory power than a single case. You'll see here in this case, in this study, that we kind of look at those two examples together to understand what is something that's generalizable from these two examples. So working with the tribal subcommittee, we identified two cases. And we conducted open-ended interviews with 18 representatives of federal and tribal nations. And we use this what's called a purposive sampling. So we reached out to, the three people that were recommended, and we asked each of those three people, who else do you recommend we speak with? And so in that way, we were able to do essentially a census of all of the lead federal and tribal partners that were involved with this effort. That really helped us to confirm that our work was fully representative of what was going on. We developed those cases and we shared back that research with participants to confirm, did we get this right? So the two cases we'll be sharing today are from the 11-Point Wild and Scenic River. That is on the Mark Twain National Forest and in work with the Osage Nation. And the second case is the Fossil Creek Wild and Scenic River. That's on the Coconino and Tonto National Forests with the Yavapai Apache Nation. So first I'll walk through the Osage Nation and the 11-point example. Then I'll walk through the Fossil Creek, and then we'll break them down side by side. So the Osage Nation, their original name translates to Children of the Middle Waters, and that really signifies their relationship with rivers and other water bodies across the Midwestern United States. They have many sacred sites across what is today the Mark Twain National Forest, as well as the 11-Point and other rivers that are associated with caves, rock shelters, cairns, and mounds. The Osage peoples occupied lands in present-day Missouri, Arkansas, and Oklahoma for over 1,000 years. And starting in 1808, they were forced to sign a series of treaties with the U.S. government, ceding most of their land back, almost all of their land back. And they were actually had to purchase reservation land in Northeast Oklahoma in 1872. So they are considered a removed tribe. The 11-Point Wild and Scenic River was designated in 1968. It is one of the original 8 wild and scenic rivers that was signed into law with the original act. It is managed by the Mark Twain National Forest, and it shares a boundary with the Irish Wilderness, as well as more extractive logging forests on the forest. So it's kind of setting the scene, regionally across the Midwest, there's been a growing effort to improve government-to-government relationships with tribal nations through various efforts, including the Bridging the Gap Conference. There's also a Tribal Homelands Working Group that's been ongoing for several decades, and this work has really helped to transform some of those relationships with the tribes. But the relationship between the Osage and the Mark Twain National Forest was fairly tumultuous for a long time until 2016. The forest got a new supervisor who really encouraged her staff to re-emphasize those relationships with tribes as a fundamental part of their work. So in preparation for visiting all of the tribes on their lands, the forest asked each of those tribes to prepare a list of 3 things they do well and 3 things they could do better. So they really put the ball in the court of the tribes to say, hey, now's your opportunity to share with us what we can improve. And the Osage Nation really saw that as a good faith effort to start to improve those relationships. And they came back to the forest and they said, it's the Section 106 of the 1996 Historic Preservation Act that we really would like for you all to focus on more. And for those of you who are not familiar, Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act requires federal agencies, and by extension, any state, local, or private projects requiring federal funding or permits to consider how those projects are going to affect historic and cultural resources. The law requires consultation with tribal preservation offices and to seek ways to reduce harm to those resources. So the Osage representatives requested that the forest prioritize compliance with Section 106, and this is really seen as foundational to getting to that shared stewardship that came further down the road. So we see that, we see that they were able to amend the process for Section 106 and actually signed a programmatic agreement with all of the tribes that are represented on their forest, which really elevated them to signatories to review and comment on all of the outgoing contracts for the forest. And this really started to strengthen some of those relationships and allowed the forest and the tribe to work together. Um, Fast forward to 2024, and some of the outcomes of that collaborative effort on the Wild and Scenic River is that they were able to provide an appendix to the Comprehensive River Management Plan. And so not only were their perspectives included directly, word for word, through that appendix, but they were also working with the forest to make sure that some of the changes that they wanted to see in the plan were reflected. So, for example, we have the ORV prehistory from the 1975 CRMP, and that was changed in 2024 to be more respectful and to refer to pre-European contact. Pretty basic change, but something that the tribe felt was more representative of their relationship with the forest, with the federal government, and with the river. And there was no mention of tribes in the original CRMP. And so not only did the new CRMP recognize that tribes exist and have relationships with these waters, but again, the Osage was supported to provide an appendix that really directly, word for word, shares their perspective on their relationship with the forest. With the river. Now, switching gears to the Yavapai Apache Nation and Fossil Creek, we have to tell the story a little bit differently because the Yavapai Apache Nation is not considered a removed tribe. So what we know about Fossil Creek is that it is considered a birthplace for Western Apache tribes and the homelands of the Yavapai people. Although they are originally distinct, the Yavapai and Apache people have a somewhat blended culture through a shared history of relocation and assimilation, starting in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Fossil Creek is remote and allowed the Apache families who lived there to hide out to avoid being relocated to the San Carlos Reservation in 1875. And this allowed some families to preserve some of their culture, and that was then shared back to the families that did return when they were allowed back. In the early 1900s, there was an effort to create a hydroelectric facility, and both the Yavapai and Apache people worked for the Arizona Power Service to help build, maintain, and run the Childs Irving's hydroelectric dam, which turned the spring-fed waters to electricity. And some of that infrastructure included 2 power plants, a road, and about 9,000 feet of concrete flumes that carry water 4 miles to the plant. To house families working on the system, there was a small village along the creek that remained in place until 1950 when it was removed. And several of the families remember that their grandparents and great-grandparents lived in that village, so they had a really deep connection to the landscape. And in 1992, the Yavapai and Apache on the Camp Verde Reservation renamed themselves the Yavapai Apache Nation. That allowed them to reflect both the distinctions between their tribes while also recognizing that they have this shared history and governance. So the nation's government and much of the community remains located on the Camp Verde Indian Reservation, which is about 25 miles from Fossil Creek. So it's fairly close by. And starting in 2009, the hydroelectric facilities were decommissioned. That was preceded by the removal of a road that tribal members considered to be forest mismanagement because they really wanted to retain access to those facilities. And as the hydroelectric facilities were decommissioned, at the same time, we see that the Fossil Creek was designated as a wild and scenic river, and it's one of two wild and scenic rivers for the state of Arizona. In this case, we see that when it was decided that the dam would be decommissioned, the Yavapai Apache Nation reached out to the Forest Service to request certain infrastructure be left in place. That was including that road that I mentioned was decommissioned. The road really provided that access for elders to sacred areas. And the Forest Service verbally agreed to maintain that infrastructure, but the decision was ultimately overridden by solicitors at the regional level. And the Yavapai Apache Nation really considered this to be gross mismanagement by the Forest Service. After dam removal, there was an explosion in visitor use in the area, and that really resulted in negative impacts for public safety, but also cultural and natural resources. And the Yavapai Apache Nation felt that this was unacceptable, so they reached out to the Forest Service to let them know. In response, the Forest Service engaged with the nation through a couple of different mechanisms to discuss how to manage the Fossil Creek moving forward. First, together, the Yavapai Apache Nation and the Forest Service helped to convene the Fossil Creek Working Group. That was a collaborative of local governments, state and federal agencies, tribes, universities, and nonprofits that allowed them to discuss and inform planning, and as well as interim management and build capacity for Fossil Creek. As a result of this work, the Forest Service began limiting visitor access, eventually through a permit allocation system for peak season. This led to the development of a tribal permit system to help maintain tribal access to Fossil Creek. And the forest and district archaeologists work directly with the nation to develop and write the heritage sections of the Comprehensive River Management Plan. This work helped to reconnect the tribe with some culturally significant sites and ensured that the plan reflected tribal values and priorities. And the nation remains involved in monitoring the cultural ORV with archaeologists, and they go out with elders and youth. And the nation alone holds the ability to determine if the cultural ORV is being maintained or degraded. And steps to restoring this ORV are to be recommended by the nation. So we see a much stronger legal precedent here with the shared stewardship between the Yavapai Apache Nation and the Fossil Creek Wild and Scenic River. So through these case studies, we identified three major processes and outcomes of shared stewardship, and each has a theme that connects both cases. Again, it's kind of that what is generalizable about this. So we'll walk through each of these themes to see how they play out in each case study. And these issues, these processes and outcomes include issues that necessitated changing relationships, policies that were leveraged for shared stewardship, and outcomes of wild and scenic river shared stewardship. So first, on the 11-point case study, we see that the relationship between the Osage Nation and the Mark Twain National Forest had a history of tension. When the National Forest hired a new forest supervisor and an archaeologist who has experience working with tribes, this really instigated that need to understand better how can we improve relationships with the tribes. This we see shifted from a one-way consultation where the forest was telling the tribes what was going to happen to more of a two-way collaboration. And we heard from an Osage Nation Historical Preservation Office representative that Through this work, we did the hard work to create the environment for good communication. So that good communication was really seen as foundational to not just improving the relationships, but to getting to the point where there's some shared stewardship outcomes. And this change in relationship was really tested in 2017 when there was a major flood event, as well as some unrelated damage due to wildlife to some Osage burial mounds. And because they had put in place this improved process for working together, they were able to mitigate some of those impacts and really start to test the strength of that relationship. In the case of the Fossil Creek, really a lot of what we saw where we start to see some of the changing relationships is around this 2005 decision to remove the road access. Again, it was referred to as Forest Service mismanagement, and it heightened some of the tensions that the tribe felt with the Forest Service, which were again elevated in 2009 following Wild and Scenic River designation and dam removal that really threatened existence of and tribal access to their cultural sites. When the Yavapai Apache Nation requested that the Forest Service change management, and the Forest Service responded by working with the nation to develop visitor use policies to control public use. This really helped to put in a tribal permit system that has facilitated tribal access to those cultural sites. This response to accommodate tribal requests and develop creative solutions to problem solving also further helped to improve their relationships. And when we examine these two together, we see that there's a strong theme of the need to maintain tribal connections to wild and scenic rivers. So specifically, we saw that when the agency and tribes worked together through these changing relationships, they were able to reinforce the role of rivers as historically and culturally important sites. Wild and scenic rivers were seen, wild and scenic river protections were seen as both beneficial and detrimental to tribal connections. In the Fossil Creek example, we saw that the designation really reduced their access to and cultural memory of the infrastructure and environment that the Yavapai Apache Nation members built and managed. In contrast, on the 11-point example, we see that the designation of Wild and Scenic River offered default protection to some of those Osage sacred sites. So this is really to emphasize that it's not a one size fits all to Wild and Scenic River designations. So, for example, we see here on the lower right-hand corner the ancestral territory of the Osage, which comprises a significant part of the Midwest, and their current reservation lands on the upper left-hand side of the slide here. And updating the ORVs and including an appendix from the tribe in the new CRMP allowed tribal members to reaffirm their connection to their homelands, despite not having had access for over a century. And here's a really beautiful example from the appendix where the nation says, for Osages today, our history is deeply connected to the riverways of Missouri. Our ancestors lived, traveled, and were buried along these rivers. They understand that water was essential for life. Along these riverways, our ancestors prayed for the well-being of their children. It's necessary we honor and protect these places for our future generations. So what we see here is a connection from the past to the present and thinking about the future as well. And finally, co-development of those ORVs offered a way to engage a broader range of histories, relations, and values in ways that are beneficial to river management. And tribal input on those desired conditions for river management influenced visitor limits, as well as desired ecological outcomes. The next connecting theme we saw were around policies leveraged for shared stewardship. On the example of the 11 point, we saw that improving compliance with Section 106 streamlined the possibility for a programmatic agreement with the Osage Nation as well as other tribes to work alongside and with the forest. This programmatic agreement set the terms of collaboration for that historic preservation work, not just on the Wild and Scenic River, but across the forest. And through working across a wide variety of touch points, both on the river as well as across the forest, it really streamlined that trust and communication. So when it came to issues around funereal and spiritual sites, they're able to work together on some of these issues as they emerge. In the case of the Fossil Creek, we saw a long history of formal and informal consultation. This is often what we might call like hanging out, really simple as spending time during lunch, not necessarily sending a calendar invite, but dropping in. And that was really important to develop the relationships that enabled consultation on the CRMP. To offset the financial costs of the involvement of the nation, the Coconino National Forest funded a forest-wide challenge cost share that was associated with the National Association of Tribal Historic Preservation Officers, which is a national nonprofit focusing on tribal historic preservation. Through this agreement, funding was made available to support tribal monitoring of those cultural ORVs that are outlined within the Comprehensive River Management Plan. Similarly to the 11-point case, we saw that Section 106 played a critical role in the CRMP to both to identify those cultural ORVs, but also to pursue a traditional cultural property designation within the Wild and Scenic River space. And that we see here that the Wild and Scenic River Act and Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act really work together to strengthen cultural environmental protection outcomes. And when we look at these two examples combined, we see the role of archaeologists as bridge builders for this work. So often in the Wild and Scenic River world, we tend to think of the Wild and Scenic River Act as the main guiding policy. But what we learned was that archaeologists and heritage program managers, as well as tribal relations specialists, especially as they worked through other adjacent policies, not necessarily the Wild and Scenic River Act, they were able to serve as critical bridge builders. This could be formally, as we saw through the cultural preservation issues through Section 106, or informally through lunches or other opportunities to talk about projects. And we heard from the former Coconino National Forest tribal liaison that the district ranger at the time was an archaeologist. She would go and pick up lunch and meet with the nation and sit down and consult and talk about projects as frequently as needed. It was not very formal. They would just meet all the time, and that's actually the way it should be. So really this emphasis on, yes, the formal meetings on calendars, but also the informal drop-ins just to have those relationships and connections and know who to talk to about certain issues. So we saw that strong Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. It also helped the forest to strengthen compliance with other key policies that impact tribes. And this opened up opportunities to work on issues around river access, recreation management, and other things that are more immediate in the Wild and Scenic River world. Finally, when it comes to the outcomes of Wild and Scenic River shared stewardship, on the 11-point example, we see that there were a lot of changes to the Comprehensive River Management Plan in the 2024 version that includes the inclusion of heritage-related ORVs, the recognition of tribal history through those ORVs, and again, that appendix of the Osage Nation included as a way to inform management of pre-European ORVs. And this is really interesting as far as, having a list of culturally important plants that could be used for restoration should some flooding event wipe out some of the stream bank. And we also see that they're pursuing other shared stewardship of cultural resources beyond the Wild and Scenic River designation. And what we see here in the CRMP is that the 11-point Wild and Scenic River provides an incomparable opportunity to designate traditional cultural properties, reestablish traditional gathering places, and provide the Osage Nation opportunities in keeping with the Forest Service broader trust responsibilities. So the CRMP is really now this mechanism that the forest can point to say, we can work on these other things. We can use culturally important plants for restoration. We can work on designations of traditional cultural properties. So the CRMP really opens up all of these other opportunities. In the case of Fossil Creek, what we see is that the development of the Comprehensive River Management Plan is that the Yavapai Apache Nation was really responsible for co-developing that alongside the forest, in particularly the drafting of those ORVs. The Yavapai Apache Nation is responsible for shared monitoring of those cultural resources and for determining when thresholds for those cultural ORVs have been met or surpassed. They are working with the forest to iteratively inform a tribal permit system for access. As visitation waxes and wanes, they're able to either increase tribal access permits or, reduce river recreation permits. So it's really kind of this living process that they're working through. And like the 11-point, they are also pursuing other shared stewardship initiatives within and beyond the Wild and Scenic River corridor. So when we look at these two outcomes together, we see that shared stewardship is really a virtuous cycle. So we know that shared stewardship within the Wild and Scenic River can lead to additional efforts. So for example, on the 11-point, we see that improved compliance with the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act allowed the forest to identify and protect other sacred sites that were both within the Wild and Scenic River corridor as well as beyond. And they're working together to develop a cave management plan to help protect some of those cultural values. In the Fossil Creek example, we see that there is a nomination of a traditional cultural property within the Wild and Scenic River corridor. The tribe also worked with the Forest Service, other tribal nations, and other counterparts to advance an emery oak collaborative tribal restoration initiative, really focusing on this keystone species of the emery oak and identifying best practices for restoration and doing some of that restoration work on the ground. And taken together, I'm really excited about the key ingredients that we saw that led to successful shared stewardship. We see that, kind of in the headwaters of this graphic, we see flexible expectations, mutual respect, supportive leadership, proactive communication, common ground, respect for tribal sovereignty. All of these are sort of the key ingredients to what makes for successful Wild and Scenic River federal tribal shared stewardship. And some of those outcomes include traditional access, tribal access to homelands, honoring collaborative agreements, inclusive agency protocols, inclusive language in those agreements, coordination beyond the Wild and Scenic River corridor. And so we really think this graphic represents a summary of what makes for successful shared stewardship, both the inputs and what's possible on the output side of things. And, thinking about this work, I really wanted to make sure that there were some takeaways for Wild and Scenic River managers, for you all attending this call, for folks that are interested in doing this work on the ground. We identified 5 actions that managers can take in this work. The first action is to recognize that Wild and Scenic Rivers are important they're more than sites of play and restoration. They are significant sites of human history, really dating back to the origin of people on the continent and marking the complexity of human migration, relationship, and experience. Wild and scenic rivers hold significant stories of our nation prior to and after colonization. Relationships are central to any work that you do. The work of prioritizing relationships is really where the rubber meets the road. So we found that managers who spend time with tribal counterparts, often in informal settings, were much more effective at building the necessary relationships. Um, relationships are necessary to ensure that there is some flexibility to those timelines, and that we also saw the value of creativity in this work, recognizing that how managers are building these approaches matters, in terms of that process, but also on the outcome side of things. So I don't know that the Mark Twain National Forest managers went in thinking that they'd come out with an appendix for the Osage, but that was really a creative solution to make sure that the Osage perspective did not get watered down. We also recognize the value in centering that historical context of federal tribal relations. If you are wearing an agency badge, you are coming with 250 years of history in relationship to our tribal counterparts, recognizing that you are carrying the weight of the federal government, and that it's not you. It is a long storied history. It's complicated, but taking time to learn that history is really important when you approach this work. Um, so there's a lot about sort of the squishy stuff, the relationships, kind of building your own capacity, but there's so much value in the accountability of it all through plans and through shared monitoring. So we really also we don't want to lose the fact that these comprehensive river management plans do create some of that accountability so that when the next forest supervisor comes around or the next wild and scenic river manager is onboarded, they have a document to point to that says, here's the formalized agreement that we have. And we've created all of these mechanisms to make sure that tribal voices are not lost in this work. And there's tons of opportunities out there for individuals to identify and engage available resources, to learn about how to do this work with tribes in a good way. And so we really want to emphasize that some of there's a lot of this that's on the agency side, or if you're a nonprofit, really having that institutional support. But some of it is also on the individual to be curious, to come with, an open heart and an open mind to want to learn about how to do this work in a good way. So circling back, again to this idea that we have a lot of dated CRMPs out there, but there's so many opportunities to do something new, to do something creative and inspiring. I encourage folks that are managers of rivers, or partners with some of those managers to think about the ways in which our comprehensive river management plans can be transformative, empowering, and restorative. We want to ask ourselves, who will lead this work? How will the work be done? And what will it accomplish? So there's lots of possibilities out there. And that's all I have. Thank you all for your attention.